Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public... Oops, sorry, I'm giving it all away. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Okay. I'm nervous, too. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here at the Whitney, and it's my distinct privilege to introduce Zoe Leonard and Rebecca Solnit. The occasion for their conversation tonight is the stunning exhibition, Zoe Leonard's Survey, which is on view on the 5th floor. Looking across Zoe's career, the show highlights her engagement with a range of themes, including the history of photography, gender and sexuality, loss and mourning, migration, displacement, and the urban landscape. More than it focuses on any particular subject, however, Zoe's work slowly and reflectively calibrates vision and form. A counterexample to the speed and disposability of image culture today, Zoe's photographs and sculptures and installations ask the viewer to re-engage with how we see. I want to thank Bennett Simpson, who curated the exhibition, and especially express my gratitude to my colleague Elizabeth Sherman, who organized the presentation of the show here at the Whitney. I hope you've all seen the show at least once already, and that you will continue to come back to the Whitney over the next several months to spend time with Zoe's work and this extraordinary show. As Holland Cotter wrote in his review in the New York Times, quote, "For this artist, time, ductile and emotionally loaded, seems as important a medium as photography or sculpture." Time, and particularly its relationship to the medium and the history of photography, is one of the many points of intersection between these two brilliant women. Although she might be best known today as the author of the feminist manifesto, Men Explain Things to Me, which, by the way, turns 10 years old this month, writer, historian, and activist Rebecca Solnit is the author of, I think, more than 20 books on feminism, Western and Indigenous history, popular power, social change and insurrection, wandering and walking, hope, and disaster. Her book, River of Shadows, Edward Muybridge and the Technological Wild West from 2003, is a wonderful analog, to borrow Zoe's term, to Zoe's long engagement with the history of photography, the genre of landscape, and the nature of perception in works such as You See I Am Here After All from 2008, among others. In thinking about both Zoe and Rebecca's investigations and long commitments to the vast and complicated concept of the American landscape, before I turn things over to them, I want to acknowledge that we are here tonight on unceded Indigenous lands, specifically the territory of the Lenni-Lenape. I make this acknowledgement intentionally and inspired by Rebecca very hopefully. I would like this recognition of territory to remind us of the continuing legacy of settler colonialism in the United States, a history that artists like Zoe Leonard and critics like Rebecca Solnit help us to see and hopefully to work to change. So please welcome Zoe and Rebecca.
I feel like, are we mic'd? Can you hear us? Hello. Well, then I'll begin by saying that I grew up on Coast Miwok land, but now live on Ohlone land in San Francisco on the other coast. And that these indigenous histories, I think, are for both of us part of feeling the deep time in the American landscape, which when we were growing up, we were told was new and blank and empty and without culture.
Yeah.
But how are you, Zoe?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm nervous. Rebecca Solnit.
I'm nervous, Zoe Leonard. But what you should know is we're exactly the same age, and neither of us really went to high school. We both have GEDs, like Edward Snowden, and and I've always kind of tried to collect people the same age as me because I don't have a built-in peer group, and it's kind of like, well, what did you do with this span of time? And I've been sort of living parallel to you. I remember your show, Larry Rinder, born the same year as us, curated at Matrix in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And so it's funny because it feels like we've been moving through these transformative times together.
It's true.
And trying to reflect on them in our work in these ways that are and aren't analogous. But perhaps
true.
you have a
That's
clicker
true.
you'd like to click something
I
with.
will click something. I will click something.
Speaking
And-
of proof, 56 years, 56 suitcases.
Yes. Yeah.
But what not to?
This. Do you want to talk about this work a little bit?
I was
or
curious,
just-
and what I loved about this and some of the book projects and the postcards was the sense of accumulation, of kind of collecting all the time, and the kind of residue accumulation that had built up, and the sense of slow time and time is cumulative in all of them. And these ones reminded me of geological strata, which are usually vertical, but sometimes tilted, and tree rings and other things where you see, kind of iterations of years in them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they form a kind of, there's a kind of topographic quality too.
Yeah.
And maybe time in that sense, in terms of the time that's both the span that's implicated and the age of the suitcases. But it's also a way of shifting time in the gallery, having a very kind of long work of art that's positioned, what's that called, not perpendicular to the entrance. You sort of have to move around it and walk the length of it. So it's also a way of offering a slowing down to the viewer to actually circumambulate and circumnavigate, and to start thinking about their own body in space and in place, maybe is. And I think it's related to a few other works in this room. And this room sort of maybe introduces this idea of one's perspective on a landscape and then one's presence in a landscape, and those two things as being kind of related. So details of two photographs in that room. But maybe I'll skip a little more to, like, this is another kind of topography, right?
Yeah.
And a different also kind of time. There are these sort of layers of the cards. This was my, this was a work table in my studio, and to make another work that we're going to talk about in a second, I was collecting and sorting postcards, and then sort of noticed that it was making this beautiful kind of topography. And so you have each image, they're organized by the position the photograph is taken from. But they sort of form a map, but they also form a kind of record of the distribution of those cards, like which ones there were more of and which ones there were less of, and how also postcards circulated as a really intimate form of communication between people. So it's also the letter writing, and the sort of all the implication of those histories is also in there, as it is with the suitcases. So.
I hadn't thought of the fact that they're postcards themselves, and I love the writing on the ones that you can see on the wall, but that each of them had their own little journey, from the site through the mails to, and thereafter. And the accumulation, again, is really, and here it does feel like strata.
Yeah.
Should
we click? Here we go. So there's this one. And I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about, like, when Megan first brought you up, I was incredibly excited for many reasons. I have read several of your books, and they've been really important to me. But also because we have this overlap in a kind of consideration of the American landscape, both as a real physical place and a place that has had a number of different ideologies or ideas projected onto it, and also kind of metaphorically or politically as the American landscape as a kind of state of mind or a political state that is shifting, dynamic, problematic, and that both of us are facing this question, I think, of how to be an American artist right now. Like, what do you think of that, Rebecca? Like, how do you do you think of yourself as an American artist, and do you kind of like...
I do. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans after Katrina, where I learned a lot of times musicians, no matter how successful, stay in their neighborhoods because they feel like they belong there, that the neighborhood brought them up and they need to give back. So you see like the great trumpet players teaching little kids to play trumpet and things like that. The Wynton Marsalis and his family and Fats Domino stayed where they were, but just built fancier houses in the same poor black neighborhoods. And so I feel like I'm a San Franciscan and then a Californian and then an American. And it feels like there's a kind of glorious experimentality. And the U.S. is an experiment that isn't finished, so it's failed frequently and often horrifically, but we're still inventing and rectifying, and it feels different than some of the more homogenous and stable countries. Now it feels like we're facing the worst presidency in U.S. history and the utter turmoil of that. At the same time as this incredible demographic shift I'm super excited about. Half the people, I keep mentioning, sorry those of you who hang out with me who hear this all the time, half the people under 18 in this country are not white. The whole, and this new thing just revealed that only 43% of Americans are white Protestants. And so the whole idea that this is a white Protestant country is fading away pretty rapidly. And this rising generation that rose up a couple of days ago against guns, I think is going to transform things more. So what these places mean, and we're going to look at my Yosemite project with some photographers a little bit. And that was so interesting because the history I had done in the early 1990s was so much about Native people being eradicated and exterminated by the kind of genocidal white governmental policy, but also the genocidal white imagination of people like Ansel Adams and John Muir reinventing Yosemite as a virgin wilderness when it was clearly a homeland. And it felt like this indigenous colonial conflict when I worked on it in the early 90s. 10 years later in the early 2000s, I went back with the photographers Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe to...
Do you want me to skip forward to that?
Yeah,
we can always skip back.
We can. To rephotograph there, and that's some of it, that's some of it.
Should I...
let's stay here let's go on the panorama for a minute. This is a low resolution image from my laptop that my collaborators would be really annoyed by. But this is a lake called Lake Tenaya, which lots of people love. They don't know that this is not the indigenous name. The U.S. Army captured the leader of the cultural group, whose name is Tenaya, and this horrible man who thought he was very cultured because he loved landscape, which was a sign of your gentility then, your connoisseurship. And he said, well, your people will never live here again, but I'm naming the lake after you. And Tenaya looked at him and said, it already has a name. And that interchange kind of created my whole book, Savage Dreams, just named after James Savage, who led the army. But so we went back 10 years later, and here's the picture on your left is Edward Muybridge in 1872. 75 years later, Edward Weston comes and stands 3 feet away and makes the bigger black and white. A few years after that, Ansel Adams, who really liked his distant, sharp focus shots, makes the far image one. And then we kind of fit in the, Mark and Byron did all the technical stuff. I did the historical work, and we were all in dialogue. But so so I came back 10 years later, and it was a different place because there were so many people whose history was not white settlement. And we were actually photographing one of Ansel Adams' most iconic images, Clearing Winter Storm, and there was a South Asian family of men and boys listening to, God, what would we call the music? Just kind of fantastic music and doing very kind of subcontinental dance styles in the parking lot. And it felt like this is not one simple history. So so part of what's fascinating for me, and that I really felt looking at the show and thinking about the fact that we're both kind of came of age in the 80s, is that we're very much American artists, but that keeps changing. And your work was so much about homophobia and AIDS and confronting what it meant to be queer in the 1980s, which is really different. There was a specific struggle there in specific landscapes, this is a long diatribe of an answer.
Yeah, that's okay.
And so, but it feels
That's
like,
good.
what does it mean to be an American? And it's like, you get to keep asking new questions. There isn't really an answer. What does it mean to be an American artist? You just keep making stuff in response to something that keeps changing.
Right.
You know, it's like you're photographing something that's changing all the time. You're capturing the proteus as it morphs.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting, I came to your work first because of, I'm just going to actually back up to these Muybridge photos.
Yeah.
The first book of Rebecca Solnit's that I read, your first book was the Muybridge book, which it's about Muybridge, and it sort of tracks his biography, but it's also much more than a biography of a single figure, because you really talk about this particular moment in the late 19th century when the government surveyors are surveying the land west of the Rockies. The railroads are crossing, the gold rush is happening, and there's a huge move of white settlers out to the west coast. And there's such a particular role that photography plays, not only in recording that shift, but also being an engine of that shift, because the camera was used to survey and also to portray, to kind of images went back to wealthy business people and patrons on the East Coast and even in Europe, saying like, oh, these are the resources that are there, these are the people that are there, this is timber we can cut down, these are railroads we can build, these are natural resources we can plunder, these are places we can settle. And so photography had a very specific role in all that. And I think some of that heritage is something I think a lot about in my work too, like the Niagara Falls piece, You See I Am Here After All, and those postcards sort of span from the late 19th century through to the 1970s or so. And that landscape, that particular feature of land Niagara Falls was always this magnificent natural wonder. But a number of different ideas about what it was projected on it. In the early days when European settlers arrived, it was about territory and claiming a land. At other times it was a sort of symbol of the sublime. Later it became a place where people went for honeymoon, and so it became a kind of symbol of romantic love and hence of sexuality. There was the Marilyn Monroe movie Niagara in the 50s, which was sort of about the uncontainable power of a woman's desire and how everyone has to die if the woman has desire. And so this sort of like different set of things that are not inherent to the land itself, but that are relational to how we view and social and commercial desires onto the land. So a lot of the things that you wrote about in Muybridge sort of tuned me into your work, and it felt like very tied to your environmentalist work, but also to the sensitivity you've had to photography specifically as a kind of double agent or something. Could you, it was so interesting, the photographers in the West End, you get to know them. I've worked with Mark Klett, who started rephotographing the U.S. Geological Survey guys with Joanne Verberg and Ellen Manchester in the 1970s, and stuck with rephotography. And like, they're very different people, so the Civil War photographers who came on the Geological Survey, Muybridge, who's an Englishman who comes without the anti-Indigenous prejudices, but his own kind of snobberies, Carlton Watkins, and things like that. And it's interesting because it's helping us know the way that Edward Curtis portraits of Native people know what was there, at the same time that it's usually serving development, exploitation, etc. It's also so postmodern, because there's a way people are looking at, like, when only a few hundred white people have ever been to Yosemite Valley,
pictures of Yosemite by Watkins are winning prizes at the Paris World's Fair.
Right.
And when I came, as a Westerner looking at Baudrillard and the procession of simulacra, a big catchphrase, young people, for all of us in the 1980s and stuff. I was like, postmodernism, that's so 19th century.
Yeah.
That there
Oh my God,
was
that's
just
great.
these ways in which,
That's amazing,
there was a kind of,
Yeah.
photography was part of, despite the burden of documentation it's always carried, was part of not describing but inventing the West in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And actually related to that, we were talking about this is also Edward Muybridge, and this particular point you were just making, which ties back to Megan's introduction, was the idea of surveying the land as if it was just land. It's empty land. It's there for the taking. It's rather than a fully occupied continent. It was a fully occupied continent.
Yes.
There's actually, it strikes me as being connected to also photography of the Middle East in the 19th century. A lot of the photographs of Palestine are that there are sort of two different sets of photographs. This scholar named Nasser, I wish I jotted it down at home. It's a book I haven't looked at in a while, but there's a set of photographs of like a fully populated country with orange groves and like a fully populated country.
Yeah.
But then there are these other landscape photographs that present it as an unoccupied land that's free for the taking. And so these Muybridge pictures, where he does have Native people, strike me as breaking out of a number of the 19th century conventions of either having people portrayed very, very small, incidentally, or not at all. So would you talk a little bit about these two?
I would. What is interesting is that the American West was very empty. Indigenous, it was all indigenous homeland, but people lived as hunter-gatherers do, very dispersed overall, more concentrated like on the Rio Grande and the New Mexico pueblos. And so you do, but people, and there is this weird way in the 20th century that American landscape photography is unpopulated. Nobody belongs in it. It becomes kind of a convention. When we were rephotographed, so Mark Klett and company did this rephotography project for this bicentennial in 1976 and thereafter with the U.S. Geological Survey guys who'd been active in the 1870s. At the end of the 1990s, they came back to rephotograph it because a lot of these places have changed again in the subsequent 20, 25 years. Mm-hmm. And there was this very funny moment. I was with them in Yellowstone National Park when, there had been a picture by O'Sullivan, or I'm trying to remember who it would have been in Yellowstone.
Frank.
Who?
Maybe Frank.
No. Photo historians, feel free to shout it out. Timothy.
Could have been O'Sullivan.
Timothy O'Sullivan. Who was the other? Anyway, I did not brief myself on this part of the rusty archive in my head. But so like somebody, Mark, I sent one of his collaborators to stand by the geyser as somebody had in the 1870s picture. And tourists got so upset, it wasn't a good photograph if it had a person in it. Right. People had so learned that a good landscape photograph is unoccupied. And I think that comes out of Ansel Adams and this kind of Piers tradition, which is also partly about insisting photography is art and elevated, and the American West is pure and empty and virginal. And that's a useful argument in a way for creating national parks and protecting land from development. Nobody when the national park system is created in 1892, or when Yosemite is set aside, is going to argue for. Actually, I'm getting all my dates are all jumbly now. But,
that's okay.
Is going to argue that this is indigenous homeland. That's not a good argument. It's a racist country that's trying to exterminate these people and assumes that they're gone. But
I think it also has to do with an idea of landscape painting, which I think photography in the early days in the 19th century was sort of imitating or using the pictorial conventions of landscape painting. So there's an idea of the Sublime and this whole, and I think what's interesting with Muybridge is you start to see this, the potential for the shift to the modern, or even to the postmodern, and actually by embracing the differences between photography and painting, and there's a kind of release into what are the actual capabilities of the photograph, which are things that painting can't do. And so when Muybridge later then moves, the kind of revolution in time that he helped us understand was happening, like, you know, the sort of the correlation between like the railroad and the camera and the beginning of cinema, and their sort of deeply bound industrial relationships in the creation of, you know, the beginning of, I don't know, modernity, I guess you'd say, and that they also have to do with kind of sequence and motion and things happening faster than the eye can follow. And there's this beautiful chapter in Muybridge, now I'm going to just remember because I haven't reread the book in a while, but where you talk about what happens with time, and that before railroad time, before time was standardized across the continent, you could be in Connecticut and it would be the sun would rise and you could call that 6 o'clock, and the sun would set and you could call that 7 p.m. You could, but the need for the railroad had to have, like, you had to make time consistent. You had to
so
have,
that
like,
the trains wouldn't collide
time.
and you knew when they would show up.
Exactly.
Because the sun actually rises 12 minutes earlier in Boston than it does in New York City.
Exactly.
And so, like, noon used to, and it didn't matter because, like, with stagecoaches and horses and wagons and on foot, it doesn't matter if, like, you walk from Boston to New York or ride your horse and the clocks are different because, and that was such a shock to me when I finally understood that until railroads, clocks told you noon was when the sun was highest overhead, wherever you were exactly. Mm-hmm. And that meant that the clocks told you about the celestial bodies in your place in the universe. Right. And then we changed what clocks do. They tell you how to align with the industrial system. And people were really angry that they were told that their clocks were no longer going to be aligned with the heavens, they were going to be aligned. And you can actually see it sometimes. I had a friend who lived on the border between Utah and Nevada, which is a timeline between Mountain Time and Pacific Time. And she's so far east that the sun set about an hour earlier than it did in San Francisco, but we're on the same time. But she was a wonderful old woman who'd built a house herself, was an environmental activist. We'd sit and watch the light, the shadows of Baker National, of Great Basin National Park, the shadow of the mountain stretch east as the sun went down. Mm-hmm. And just looking, like 10 miles over there, it's 8 p.m., but where we're sitting it's 7 p.m. And you realize this is completely insane.
Yeah, totally.
And there's a lot that's just so deeply like all this stuff. Because I remember, like, postmodernism was theorized by people in very urban, sort of detached environments. And it was thought to be kind of new, and like all the smart, weird stuff was kind of urban. And a lot of it was so kind of 19th century, for example, the fact that Yosemite was primarily known through representations, the fact that these transformations in that period, the reinvention of the land, the sort of genocide by non-representation of indigenous people. But Muybridge is really interesting because he accepts chaos. And it's funny because it does relate to your photographs, that you're not looking, from what I can tell, for that kind of perfect, smooth, flawless image. You're interested in other things. But he accepted a level of chaos. And particularly his Yosemite images, I think he's hanging out with geologists and keeping up with what Darwin means, which is also a shattering of the idea that God created the world 4,000 years ago, and then there was Adam and Eve, and then there was Noah, and then Moses, and and like it's not very long, and God's like wound up the clock,
right?
And and he lets the chaos in, he lets the blur of something moving in the wind during a slow exposure, he lets these kind of seepages and things, and he also lets the native people be in the landscape,
right?
And it's interesting, some of his Yosemite indigenous pictures were commissioned by Albert Bierstadt so he could paint the native people in the landscape. although he also sometimes painted kind of like teepee braves from the Great Plains.
Right.
Another
Right.
piece of it is that the history that I had imbibed was that there were the Indian Wars, and they were like kind of about one thing, but a lot of what they're doing was preventing the railroad from coming in, which industrialized space in a way that made it possible to settle it, develop it, and take it, to drive out the buffalo herds, destroy the kind of nomadic hunter-gatherer stuff. And so that these were wars against the railroads, a lot of them on the Great Plains. Specifically, they were destroying telegraph wires, taking up railroad tracks, and that like the Gulf War for Iraqi oil, some of the Indian wars were were wars for private development and profit. That it was a lot like our time,
One
and
of
that's
the
all
things
present in those images.
You just mentioned before about the sparse population ties to something you wrote. There's a really beautiful essay you can find online called Letter from a Drowned Canyon. So we're kind of skipping around here, but there's a connection. Another project that you've been working on.
With Mark and Byron again.
With Mark and Byron, and that sort of tracks Elliot Porter's photographs of Glen Canyon before it was flooded by the building of that dam. But there was something specific I wanted to tie into there.
Was it the kind of accepting chaos, or the kind of photography over time and development?
Oh, yeah. It was about the sparseness of the population.
Yeah.
That actually this is determined by water.
Yeah.
So in in the East Coast, along the mountains of Vermont or around New York, you can support a relatively large population because things grow quickly. It's easy to grow crops. You can keep a lot of domestic animals. It can support a large population. When you get out west, water is an incredibly scarce commodity. So development, in the broadest sense of the term development, I don't only mean by white people, like the idea of living nomadically and traveling, even to this day with ranching out there, which is a largely white enterprise.
With Latinos doing all the grunt work.
And you need with Latinos working on all the land, but you need a tremendous amount of land to kind of make a living because you don't have endless graze.
Yeah, you don't need 10 acres for a cow. You need hundreds and hundreds to get enough forage.
So tied into this, I think, in terms of the development of the West, is partly the notion, the idea that was promoted that no one's living here, and then followed by the idea that the water could be redirected to support a kind of virtually endless population, right?
And thus Las Vegas and Phoenix, the idea that we can move everything around and control it and air condition it and manage it.
This project, Drowned River, that essay that I just mentioned, which takes us, it's these photographs of Glen Canyon and this one essay. I don't know if you're doing a longer. It's
a longer version in the book, and we did it. It was in the California Sunday magazine, and I think it's available online.
Yeah,
but and
this
is speaking of deep time, and it's interesting because I felt such an affinity for these works you're doing with the suitcases, with the postcards, etc., that look at kind of the passage of time, the accumulation of time. And your work, the photographic work, is so interesting with the photography books lined up in the view room and with the postcards, because it's like the postcards you say go into the 1990s and the photo books. And the sense that your career bridges this tremendous rupture, like Muybridge, of another huge acceleration in time, and our lives speed up as digital comes into being, computers take over everything. Everything can be Googled and searched and downloaded and Snapchatted and etc. Right. But there is a sense also that you don't see what's happening unless you are. And I learned that. I lived in one apartment for 25 years and realized that you had to be slower than change to see change. This is a picture of the Colorado River at the upper end of the Glen Canyon, of the Lake Powell Reservoir. The river was dammed in the early 60s, and whether you thought it was a good or a bad idea, people thought it would be there for hundreds of years, and that the river was drowned, the canyons were gone essentially forever. But it was not well thought out. They did not foresee climate change. The river is the water is overused, so the idea of storing excess, there's not excess because we're using it all. And then also like the equivalent of an enormous lake evaporates from the surface every year because it's hot and dry there. So this is a picture, I think, from 2012 and another from about 2015 or 16, where you can see the reservoir dissipating and the river returning, which was kind of a fascinating thing to document because it's both the triumph of the river over man-made interventions but because of climate change, another man-made intervention, which is a larger catastrophe.
Right.
But it was also
like,
about this kind of sense of like we think we're controlling this stuff, which was so much the paradigm of modernism, that nature is a chaos we will impose our order on.
Right.
That's really, and I think there's a kind of organic postmodernism, which is like, oh no, wait, it turned out nature was in order, we imposed our chaos on.
Right.
And, you know, and that's what this is about, is the kind of the flow of the river carving its way. So it's a very muddy river, and like walls of silt higher than this room settled, and the river is carving its way through some of them. And where we were standing was once underwater.
Right,
But,
yeah, you can see the striations there.
Yeah.
There's this really beautiful sentence in that essay. Mark Byron and I were trying to see beneath the surface of the present to find the past. I was really, really struck by that sentence as something I think I identify with as an artist in how I work, how telling a surface can be of what's beneath it, and how underneath each that there's always a structure behind something. There are decisions. There are the way something looks is affected by a whole kind of system and structure underneath it and around it, and that's not only a physical structure but also a socio-political one and an economic one, and that all of those things sort of affect what we end up seeing as a surface. Like another thing that's going on in these pictures, I'm assuming, is that there's also a preponderance of non-native invasive species. So that the plants that are going to come in and grow now are going to be really different than what was there originally, and will suck up all the water that the native plants need. So there's a number of different sort of shifts happening on that surface. But one of the things I wanted to tie that to, it's a little bit of it's not really a question, I don't know what it is, a thought.
A proposition.
Let's call it a thought, a proposition. That also this idea of trying to see beneath the surface of the present to find the past, when you use that sentence, it comes right after you're talking about, as you're taking the photographs, you're also using a depth finder to read the bottom.
Yeah.
And so that I think it's actually also a two-way thing, that you're looking beneath the surface to find the past, but also that when we understand more about the past, we understand our present moment much more sharply and in a much more complex way. And that set of ideas is something that I feel I'm always grappling with in my work. So much of my work, and maybe in particular the selection that Elizabeth Sherman and I made for the hanging here at the Whitney, we really started by asking a number of questions about where we are now, like what is this site? That we're in a building called the Whitney Museum of American Art, where it's right there, American Art, that we're in New York City, and that there are views out onto this city. That right behind us, actually, is the Hudson River. And a lot of the way we thought about the show or organized, I guess when we kind of, after many, many conversations, like I realized that both the greatest advantage to the space I was being offered and the biggest deficit was this incredible Western view that was magnificent and wonderful, but also brought in a tremendous amount of sunlight at the end of the day, so it's sort of hard to hang any artwork that you're borrowing. We learned so much about foot candles, like email me if you want to know anything about foot candles. I can tell you about them. There's a lot of foot candles in that room. So we're sort of like, it's this, and the magnificence of that kind of view feels, although the framing is very sort of sleek and modern, it feels like a kind of an old-fashioned idea, like, the beautiful, gorgeous view. Mm-hmm. And it's also really interesting. It's more, a view out a window is always going to be more interesting than any artwork you can put in a room. Like, it's always going to win. And so I didn't want to build, there's options. You can build out that wall, you can drop shades down, or you have the view, and often shows here will sort of make the last room into a kind of lounge where you have couches and you look at the catalog. And I was like, I can't build out the wall. Like, I gotta have that view. But how do we pull that view into the room and use the view as a kind of intercession, a kind of liminal space between the show and the outside world? That it's, so we built the show so you enter on the east side and you work towards this room. This is the last room in the show. So
Westward, the course of empire takes its way.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it is notable that it's a Western view.
Yeah, and the Hudson.
And it's the Hudson, which is a really complicated place, like the
from
one in
Henry
Lenape.
Hudson to the Hudson River School to the fact
and then
that
it's New York Harbor. Like,
Yeah.
if you look down to your left, you're really looking at New York Harbor. You're seeing the Statue of Liberty. You're sort of seeing a tremendous history. It's not just a sublime view. It's actually a view that's about labor and about immigration and about development. There's a highway there. It's also where the piers were, right? So there are the piers that were about people coming and going, boats coming and leaving. But also there was, Gordon Matta-Clark's Day's End, and there was like the Sex Pier, and all of that is out that window. So I wanted to find a way to bring that history into the room, but also ask the viewer to think about it, like not just accept it as like, it's a beautiful view. So I wanted it to be a thinking view as well as a feeling view or a sensational view. And so the first decision was to include the large postcard work on the perpendicular wall, the hallway that leads up, as another kind of monumentality, but that's questioned. And we can go to that slide after. And then the second was to make this work at a scale for this room. I had made another sculpture related to this one, a kind of companion piece, but at a much smaller scale. And this forms another kind of topography. It kind of mirrors the skyline across the river. And it asks this, it says how to take good pictures or how to make good pictures. That's the room people always, like, that's where people take the selfie, right? Because you get to the river. And so it was kind of also a way of drawing attention to that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because
That's just the same,
I was kind of fascinated. They stopped publishing that book in the 90s, and there is this really transformative moment for photography as digital comes in and things speed up, in a sense. Because it's also interesting thinking about your work that we've talked so much over the last 170 years of photography's history about it as like this kind of almost instantaneous thing. But listening to you, it's about like you photograph one moment, but one moment in centuries, millennia of cultural accumulation that shapes this face, this person, this location, this, this perspective, this, etc. And just that sense of what is the time inside the photograph when you see any one of your subjects in the series of the bearded woman's head in the jars is about the moment of your seeing, the moment of her lifespan, the moment of turning human beings into kind of curiosities and spectacles about, these questions about what photography should look like, and, and the kind of gender politics that you were engaging with, I think in that moment. And it's interesting, these times, and I'm thinking about kind of the sense of time you have when you make a picture, and what kind of time you want people to bring to looking at.
Sorry, it's the other way.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
At looking at that.
We'll return to that.
What, and do you think about, like, what do you want people, what does it take to see a work of art in general, or yours in particular? Like, do you watch people going through the galleries and think, do you want, like, how long does it take to see something? Because that's a question that really came up with the Yosemite project, is that 19th century sense of, like, let's look at the painting for an hour, let's look at the view from dawn till well after sunrise, versus the people kind of like show up, take the snapshot, disappear.
Right.
Which is about just how different our time sense is in the same places. And, and the Niagara thing is interesting for me, the postcard piece, is partly because the custom of the postcard, now we just text somebody the selfie of us there. Yeah. And that kind of wonderful slowness of, I buy the postcard, I write the inscription, I put the stamp on it, somebody sorts it, and it goes into this sort of beautifully antiquated system of the post office, and then somebody comes and hands it in your mail slot or your mailbox. It's kind of this whole sorting system of the universe that we don't quite have in the same way.
And at the same time, I mean, yes, absolutely, but also at the same time, like back in the teens or the 20s or the late 19th century, there were several mails a day. Like you got the morning mail and the evening mail, the afternoon mail. In a large city, you would get a couple of mails a day. And I'm actually surprised by a lot of what's on the postcards. Sometimes it's very, loving or intimate, but often it's really work a day. It's like, I'm catching the 3:40 to Lancaster. Arriving late tomorrow. Can't make it sick. And you're like, whoa, they're almost like weird little texts, because the place left in the really early cards, like the ones before 1910, the front, on the front, they would leave a little blank area to write your message, and the back was just for the address. It was before they divided the backs. And people started writing on one side and the address on the other side. So they're often very short and very curt, and a shocking amount of them seem to be about people arriving and departing and being late and running late. And I was like, oh my God. So it's very different, and it's a very much slower world, but it's the beginning of industrialization, but it's a lot of the impulses to connect are the same, and a lot of the sort of logistical thing of life is, you're like, oh, it's actually much more familiar than I thought it would be, even though it's at a slower pace than what we have now. And I think, the connection to digital, I do think there's a different pace of looking, and I do think it's often you're not used, like, oh no, I'm not even going to look at it now. I'm going to take a picture of it, I'm going to look at it later on my phone, which is kind of crazy with art when you're standing in front of like a Rembrandt and you're like, oh, I'm going to just take a snap, and then I'll be like on the subway being like, wow, he could really paint. So
but it's also kind of trying to see for, that constant kind of transmission, performance for an audience. It's not like I'm looking at the Rembrandt. It's like I'm showing everyone that I'm looking at a Rembrandt.
I'm here looking at the Rembrandt. I'm here not looking at the Rembrandt.
You look at me in the Rembrandt. But you look at me in the Rembrandt, I'll look at you in the Picasso, or whatever the economy of exchange is. That kind of performative sense, and that devolves into these poor young women constantly kind of hyper stylizing themselves for their Instagram accounts.
Oh, right. You were telling me about
who was it? Somebody told me yesterday that people are getting nose jobs to make their noses look better in selfies, which tend to kind of blob out your nose.
That's so crazy.
Speaking of, postmodern, kind of turning your face into something that works in 2 dimensions. or as judged by the criteria of 2 dimensions rather than 3.
Right, yeah, it's going to look great in a picture.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I feel like it's really easy to fall into a kind of romantic ideal of like, that was better. And it's really easy to, we're older now, right? So I've got like all those suitcases, like there's 56 of them.
Eventually nobody will be able to cross the room except by leaping.
Hopefully.
In about 25
they're going to bust out the window, they're going to cross the river, be like 900 years old.
Westward, the march of suitcases take their way.
Exactly.
Although I think they're going north, but never mind.
But I think there's also, like, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
So I think in the show, I used a lot of maybe strategies. That's a kind of cold-sounding word. But I thought a lot about how people move in space. And I thought about ways to slow people down. But I also think, like, if the way people are looking at work right now is by taking pictures of it, and that's what they're doing, that's what they're doing. And I don't want to work against it. And I think when it's like, there's like signs like, don't take picture, I'm like, that's nuts. Like, nobody's going to not take a picture, and no one is going to surrender their phone. It's not going to happen. No, I turned it in. No, you're going to have your phone. So I also feel like looking at and observing and trying to work with what's actually happening maybe feels more radical, more interesting to me than to kind of say, like, the old analog way was better, and that's how we should all stay. And so treading that kind of line, like a little bit about maybe making the exhibition some things we thought about. One of the things I said about the suitcase is one of the kinds of time is the time it takes to see it and to get around it. And I hung some really small photographs on the other side of it to try to seduce you around to go see the little photographs. You've got to walk around the whole suitcase. So thinking about ways to let people feel welcome to spend time. Yeah. And this is where I think maybe dovetailing into the kind of time-space continuum is that it's not only about time but about space. In the exhibition, it's hung really sparely, and that's not only to so that things look great, but it's to leave space for the viewer. It's to actually acknowledge that part of the exhibition is missing until people arrive. And so the space for actually people to populate a place and to think about what the space is going to look like once people arrive and how the flow, how the circulation is really going to work. And I think that same principle of thinking both about time but also about, maybe I'll switch from the word space to the word position or vantage point, that I think when you were asking me about how I think about how people look at my photographs, I'm not only thinking about the time in a picture, I'm really thinking about positionality and relationship and how the vantage point from which we see, our point of view, which a photograph expresses in the frame the position from which it's taken. So it's literally like, this is how I saw that. And that that expression of positionality or subjectivity is a statement of itself. So it's not just the moment the photo was taken or the subject in the photograph, but your relationship to it, how you were looking at it, what was your vantage point. And I think that that's another sort of really specific thing about photography, and that maybe it shares it with writing. Because in writing you always have like the subject position, right? You have like first person or second person. You're always putting forth a position from which something is viewed. The I, the we, the they, the he, the she.
It's interesting to think that there are these literal things, the kind of aerial views. And I was looking through this, remembering that there was that early image of you, sort of the underskirt view of the fashion model on the runway, which is how you actually see people who are walking on a towering runway. That was really, like, circulated a lot at, in the 90s and stuff, but these views that aren't the kind of straight across, and it's funny to see them on a wall. But
Actually, at that Larry Rinder show.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was great. That was,
Yeah, long ago.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, just the sense of that part of what museums are, kind of like spaces for thoughtfulness, for people to kind of move reflectively and to become conscious of things we're often unconscious of. How do I move through this room? How do I navigate my body in relationship to these objects? What are my assumptions and things, to kind of raise these fundamental questions about representation and perception and embodiment that happen. And it's one of the things I like about entering a space like your exhibition, is like, okay, now I can start thinking about these really basic questions. It's part of why I love having grown up in the art world around artists rather than in sort of a writing world, was that artists ask these to sort of dismantle the assumptions all the way down to the bottom in a way that nobody in literature was doing. And it really kind of was my training, because you ask these fundamental questions. What do materials mean? How does this work circulate? What is the act of making, etc., that you don't ask when you're writing. Like there is conceptual writing, but not most. There weren't circles of writers, unless they're writing about visual art or writing philosophy or things like that, and who were doing those things. So
but
my 20s were spent in around visual artists, and that was really, I feel incredibly lucky to have it.
And where was that? Did you go to art school, or was
I
it just
didn't,
friends?
but in grad school, which was I got to have a master's in journalism, but I worked at SF MoMA as a research assistant, and then got hired by a little art magazine where I edited some pretty funky art criticism. But like, we got a dozen essays in every Monday, and we sent them off to press, greatly improved every Friday. And I started writing reviews myself. And then I was befriended by people like from Ann Hamilton to Louis DeSoto, Richard Mizrak, etc. And really, they were, and some of them, Anne wasn't much older, but were really my teachers. And reading the texts that were circulating, looking at the questions, looking at kind of the feminist work of that era, seeing what Larry was curating, was my education. And I'm wondering, though, if we're kind of at the the great reveal. Let's talk about Linda Nochlin, but maybe should we show, to sound like what's behind the curtain?
Let's think about them,
Okay.
Okay, good.
Okay. So, because also, do you want to talk about bringing in Linda Naughlin's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?
Yeah.
And putting it in this museum, which is named after a woman, which makes it extraordinarily rare among museums.
Right. And it was founded by a woman.
Yeah.
That's why it's named that way. It's really easy to forget that.
No, because I did a map of,
yeah.
I did the map where we changed every subway stop to a New York City woman, which was partly because we live in what yesterday I called a manscape, a place where almost everything is named after men.
So true.
Madison Avenue and the Guggenheim and the Bronx and Brooklyn and Washington and these names are everywhere and they're normalized, and you don't, even when they decided to name things after black people and great black people in Harlem, it turned out that it was going to be Martin and Malcolm and
Clayton Powell.
Yeah, and Clayton Powell, and there's this one statue of Harriet Tubman, one of the 5 statues of historic female figures in New York City.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, Joan of Arc, Golda Meir, Harriet Tubman, and I'm trying to think who's missing. There's actually, I think it's Gertrude
There's going to be one
Stein.
of you and me. Oh, there is a Gertrude Stein.
There is a Gertrude Stein one, and there's probably a few more now because the survey was done a few years ago, but not much. And it's this kind of non-representation is about growing up in a landscape where it was normal. The Hudson, is Henry Hudson, and the Bronx is a Dutch settler. There is actually a boulevard named after Anne Hutchinson in the Bronx, which is also super rare, but how do I get on that?
Yeah, because of the Whitney.
Underrepresentation, because we are in the Whitney. No, it is such an extraordinary place, this museum named after a woman on the Hudson with all its associations, but also looking out on the Chelsea Piers, which was such a site of that kind of the wild cultures of the 1980s when cities and 70s when cities were in ruins. And I love the movie Escape from New York, which was made
Oh my God.
in like,
Yeah, I
was it
remember
like
that.
1980, which assumed that New
Yeah.
York was only going to become more derelict and ruinous and criminal until it become kind of like a gated community, but as a penal colony,
Yeah.
where the incorrigibles were sent to kind of battle
Yeah.
it out in complete mayhem.
If only.
And nobody saw
if
like
only that had happened,
I know.
right?
Don't, is that
It's
like
the other
if
way.
only? Yeah.
No, I'm just saying because instead
Yeah. Well,
it was
no.
like
Instead, we
became
get
a
the
place
real
for only
estate
rich
barons.
people.
Yeah. No, the opposite happened. And it's one of the things that fascinates me, whether it's like this youth-led movement against guns or the Me Too moment or same-sex marriage, that you don't see it coming. And nobody in the 1980s saw that cities would become places, kind of suburbanized and blanded out places of
Right.
elite privilege, and poverty would be pushed to the outskirts.
Right.
Which is also so interesting because cities have been where great radical cultural generation happens. And I don't know that the big capital cities, London's been totally hollowed out by global capital and is utterly unaffordable. And a lot of the real estate is empty, like Midtown Manhattan is empty space people bought as investments but don't live in or live in 2
Right.
weeks a year.
Right.
And stuff. And so that is part of this kind of new cultural landscape. But it's also interesting for me because you must have, I think you knew David Wojnarowicz and, you know, who wrote so beautifully about Chelsea piers when there are these kind of gay sexual outlaws cruising the piers which were in ruins and dangerous, but kind of like free space for people to be radical and unregulated places. You didn't have to pay admission, and to see them be like now putting courses and climbing
I know.
walls. And hyper-regulated
I know.
for these kind of suburban pleasures that reconstruct the landscape as,
Yeah.
in an abstract way, as recreation. How did I
Yeah.
get on that? Then there was Lyndon Auckland. But I digress.
Yeah.
So you brought into this building with all these
Yeah.
resonances,
Yeah.
Lyndon Auckland's.
Yeah.
What year is that
Yeah.
essay?
71?
Oh, it's
72?
really early.
71. Yeah, really early. Well, I'm going to put a little bit of a frame around it first, maybe,
Yeah.
and sort of tie into a couple of things you were saying about the kind of looking that can happen in a museum. And
Yeah.
I think the tremendous value that making art has right now. I think so many people are in a kind of panic to become activists or do more activism or to protest and demonstrate, which is super important. But I also kind of want to, I feel like it's really important that you're writing and that I'm making work and that everyone in this room is also doing whatever else it is that they do, because that's how we transfer knowledge, like from one generation to another and from one country to another, from one person to another. We hold a really specific kind of space when we look at art or when we read a book or when we read an essay. It is a kind of contemplative space where we can think more broadly and more deeply about who we are and how we got here, but also about what we want to see. And if you're always reacting to the crazy Trump Twitter fest, and just getting angry and angry. And so there's something I think really important about the kind of spaces that we can provide for each other, where you can think more deeply about the structures underneath things, right? Where you get beneath that surface to think about what it is we want, maybe where things aren't going. It's to really think more broadly about the human condition and the agency we have within that. That it's not just happening out there, it's happening right here, right now, us in this room. This is a social moment, this is a revolution, this is, it is what it is. So the museum, they cost money to get in, so it's problematic. But I wanted to kind of make that connection, put that frame around why we do what we do, despite and along with whatever is happening in our world politically. So in this building, there are a number of places in the architecture where Renzo Piano, the architect, put a glass wall between the public gallery and circulation areas and the staff work areas. And it seems like it presents a kind of idea of transparency, but it's a very limited transparency. There's a couple of views into conference rooms and down hallways to offices. So it indicates that there's a kind of shadow museum happening that you don't see. Like, you become aware of these other spaces, that it's not just the front of house, like the museum that every viewer sees, but there's a whole machine behind it, and there's labor and people doing the work of making the shows happen. And there are also decisions being made about what has value, what should be shown, what shouldn't be, what's worth showing, what is the budget for that, which artists or what, so that it's an institution that has an agenda of its own. And so Elizabeth and I had kind of identified these spaces. We'd been trying to figure out how to adapt an earlier work, this work of mine from '92, to fit in these spaces, and it just wasn't working. But we'd fallen in love with these spaces, and we wanted to use them somehow. And Elizabeth had moved through her institution to secure these spaces for us to use for the show. I've been out in Texas, and I came back for a series of meetings. And as it happened, the Harvey Weinstein situation had just broken in the news. A few days later, the Night Landsman, news broke. And then a few days later, or maybe a week later, Linda Nochlin died. And I thought, Jesus, Linda Nochlin, right now? And I was flying back, and I just I just wanted to think about her more, so I found that essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, online, and printed it out and read it on the plane. And when I got back to Texas, I called Elizabeth, and I was like, I think I have it could be a really bad idea, but I think I know how we should use those spaces. And so over the next, this was like, to this work, I think it was right before Christmas. And we were like, okay, we're doing it. And so we took that essay, and both of us read it through a number of times, and I started chunking out excerpts of it and thinking about what are the component parts of this essay, what are the points she's trying to make, and then how do we fit it into these spaces. We can't, it's a very long essay, you can't run the whole thing, but sort of decided on certain excerpts of that essay and then paired them or tuned them to the building and thought about this particular quote or is on the way to the trustees' meeting room and the director's office. This one is maybe the quote that people will encounter first, or the most people will see. There's that staircase, and on the fourth floor, you can see from the staircase through this double glass wall into a conference room that's used. Like, there are often people sitting at this table. And we sort of were blindly doing it, and then it was so exciting when we finally screened everything on the wall to see people having meetings with this text above their heads. Oh, was that? No, there were other ones. Where? Oh, here. Oh, this is a good one. This is the break room on the third floor. The question, why have there been no great women artists, is not only the title of that essay, she uses it as a real organizing device through the essay. She repeats it a number of times, and each time approaches it from a different angle and sort of shatters it in another way, and then she comes at it from another angle and shatters it, and then comes at it from another angle. It's a really great read, deeply painful, I think, because the question still stings. And the essay still stings, and I think that's exactly why we should look at it again, because if none of these problems, if the problems had all been solved, the essay would have lost its bite, but the essay bites as hard as it did in 1971, because although on the face of it, many things have changed, on a deep structural level, on a daily level, we're encountering so many of the same sort of institutionalized forms of sexism and misogyny, which you've written about incredibly powerfully. I'm just going to segue over there for 1 second, just because we have to. This essay, I heard people talk about this essay, and it circulated wildly, and I was like, I don't really need to read that. I know how fucked up it is. I know you go to the hardware store, and then I bought the book and I read the essay, and what's so phenomenal in this essay, it's funny, it's readable, it's short, but that there's this sort of, I think, a really important distinction to be made between physical violence, sexual violence, women who are raped and murdered, and the intense urgency around real harm and criminal activity. And that's one set of conditions that I think needs to be really respected, and that it's not just a kind of sliding scale where all forms of misbehavior are the same. And then at the other side, you have the kind of workaday, everyday, kind of soaked in, institutionalized, normalized ways that women are disregarded and not paid attention to and disrespected. And the essay begins with this hilariously familiar story of someone explaining your book to you, not believing or realizing that you'd written it.
Coincidentally enough, the one about, the manly Edward Muybridge.
And he's explaining so you wrote about Muybridge. This really important book on Muybridge came out this year. Do you know about it? Meanwhile, Rebecca wrote it. And he couldn't see that because of her face.
Blonde female person.
Yeah, how could you have written the important book?
Yeah, no, I was.
But you sort of go from there outward to make these incredible implications that small, insignificant, funny, uncomfortable, nasty little event, that disregard for women actually is connected to the incredible incidence of domestic violence, of women being raped, of you sort of build out from there that not being able to see someone for their capability, for their agency, for their dignity.
Or seeing them, but knowing that you can get away with it because they have no voice. Because that's one of the interesting things is do you do these things to people because you think they have no value, or do you do it to punish them and to inflict on them their valuelessness?
Right.
And there's something, this month's Harper's, my column is called Nobody Knows, about all the things powerful people do with the assumption that the person they're doing it to is a nobody, meaning that there's you molest the child, you rape the college student, you assume that they're not a witness, they have no voice, they have no standing. And it is such an interesting moment because, really since the 1980s we've been, and there's other generations of that, who gets to vote, who gets to testify in court, who gets to sit on a jury, who gets to be a judge, who gets to write laws, who gets to, be a doctor. But we're changing kind of who has standing. But it is one of those things where it can be very light, where somebody just assumes you're not competent. I've heard so many stories from women who are astrophysicists who have men explain astrophysics to them, women, contractors who walk into the hardware store and someone explains nails to them or something, and everything in between. But that assumption that you're not qualified to speak, and I say in that essay, I read it out loud yesterday as we celebrated the anniversaries, credibility is a basic survival skill, to be able to have something, to say something, because it's one thing to say he threatened to kill me. It's another thing to say he threatened to kill me and have law enforcement, the people whose door you're knocking on, the people who, to have people actually believe you.
Right.
To have a voice is not just to be able to make noises, it's to have those noises register and have value and have consequences. And there's that inconsequentiality of people who say this happened, and people are like, you're crazy, delusional, not a reliable witness to your own life, it doesn't matter. His word will always count more than yours, which is actually still the legal code in a lot of parts of the world. And practically the legal code in our country where, some people's word, whether it's a person, the witness to a police shooting, some people's words have more consequences or less. So there's that part of it. And it's interesting, the Weinstein thing, the watershed moment has been remarkable. We've had so many outings of men for sexual violence. We've kind of lived through Bill Cosby and a lot of other stories the last 5 years. But we haven't had, and bring it on.
Yeah, I think we're reaching a time point here.
But we haven't had all these consequences of people saying, we're not just going to talk about this one person, but we're going to talk about the structural inequality.
Yes.
Like Weinstein shows us why so few women have been able to control their own lives and bodies and voices and careers. What it means when these kind of vicious heterosexual men are controlling, what stories get made. And actually,
there's
when it turned out,
there's a system in place that allows it to continue.
Yeah, and it was actually, Rebecca traced her at New York Magazine, and I think you can, go ahead, Megan, we can talk as the scene shifts.
No,
but pointed out like all the men who framed what was going on in the 2016 election, or a lot of the key players were men like Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose, who turned out to be horrific misogynists and things, that the men in charge of our stories, whether they're entertainment or news, turned out to be vicious misogynists who were shaming, silencing, discrediting, marginalizing women. And the fact that we've looked at the whole system is amazing. When Richard Brody wrote his best films of 2017, Megan and I were talking about it, he wrote in a completely different way. Like normally, that happens every year. It's so quotidian. Every magazine does it. It's like, here's my 10 favorite films. And he said, we have to think about what films got made and the films we never saw because these people of color, these women didn't get backing, they didn't get directing, they didn't get budgets. And it feels like part of this transformation we're in that the top box office films last weekend were Black Panther and A Wrinkle in Time. The first the first more $100 million budget directed by a black woman, and and Black Panther, which is becoming one of the top grossing movies of all time.
It's totally changing
the
system.
And it should have happened in 1923. It should have happened when cinema. It should have happened in 1908, but that it's happening now. And
here goes the river, people.
Yeah. Pay no attention
Yeah.
to the little woman in before the curtain. Because we thought we might still have some sunset, but I think we have night. And Jersey. And W. W for woman.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Yes. Absolutely. We put that there. It was like Elizabeth really had to pull some strings, but
it's
we're
awesome.
Like,
it's
Elizabeth
like
and Megan,
Zoe and Elizabeth kind of like strategized that. Why have there been no giant W's?
Yeah.
And then, do we have time to take some questions from the audience?
Yeah, let's do that.
Great. Okay. We would love to hear questions. There are mics, as she was saying. Speak into them, and we shall answer to the best of our abilities.
Hi, I'm over here.
Okay.
Hey.
This is for Zoe. I'm thinking about the aspect of your work, which is...
The what?
Aspect? Right?
Aspect of your work, which is kind of photography as sculpture, as topography, and how that might relate to kind of land art and some of the archetypal, Smithson, Heiser kind of earthworks, which is sort of like... topography, which becomes sculpture, which becomes photograph. And if you see a relationship there, or I'm just curious what you have to say about that.
That's such a great question. Yeah, wow. Is there a way we can lower these a teeny bit? Is that are you allowed to ask for that? Okay, awesome. Thank you.
More.
Thank you, person. Yeah, well, it's really interesting. I think the piece you see, I Am Here After All, the Niagara Falls postcard work, I actually originally made as an invitation for a commission at DIA, Beacon. And Lynn Cook is sitting right over there. I just noticed her. Lynn Cook invited me. So it was making a work literally with that, surrounded by some of those artists that you're speaking of, and some of those challenges or questions or thought trains. One of the things that I think is notably different is the kind of idea of economy of means. Like that whole piece, you can take it down and kind of put it in your pocket. I mean, not quite your pocket, but like it goes to a couple of boxes like this big, because it's dealing with images and works on paper. And there's a kind of, the scale of the whole work maybe cants towards the monumental, but it's made up of individually very small component pieces. And I think there's maybe something connected to why I make it that way, is that it's about asking you to look at what's already there as opposed to bringing, to think more deeply about what's already there rather than bringing a new gesture. But I think that that's also true of, like Richard Serra's sight lines, or there are a number of earthworks that are also about peaking the relationship to landscape, like really asking that question. There's another series I made that were these room-sized, or in one case, building-sized camera obscuras that could be walked through. And I made one of them for and with Chinati that was on view for a couple of years. And again, it's like maybe 120-foot long span of a building that was parallel to a railroad track. This is like photography, railroad track, Western landscape. And all those problems, like all the problems that's inherent to that. And again, there it was really looking at, Judd's museum, Chinati, and the artists that he invited to be a part of that place, and being well aware of the legacy there that, that Ronnie Horn was in the collection, and otherwise it's really men, although there's one collaboration. But being both aware of that and how that, oh my God, that we could talk for hours. So yeah, I'm gonna steer right out of that because. But also thinking, I learned a lot from looking at how Judd interacted with the landscape there and how he used space. So those are a group of artists that I look at and think about a lot. And there are also a number of women that are in that vein that maybe didn't get the same kind of backing and support and the things that you need, support from an institution in order to make a really a work that's ambitious in that way, that requires, a lot of concrete, really far from home. But Nancy Holt, for instance, significantly has just been acquired by DIA. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. Does that answer it? Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things that I kept thinking about in both of your works was this sense that instead of it being about time and space, that there's a shift to space in time and time and space, which then prompts the question for me of, so going forward, where do we put time?
I love it's just the small questions tonight.
You have a very large vista
just the little topics.
Just time.
Just time, just space. Just history. Just little things. Feminism.
Yeah.
You want to take this one?
could digress for hours on the subject, but it's about your work on which you may
Well, I
be.
think it's about both of our work, right? Because you're sort of seeing, you can't get off the hook.
If we're talking about the shift between time being oriented according to celestial time, for example,
Yeah.
to industrial, so where do we put it now?
Like, where have we gone? In, what is post-industrial time? There's a kind of timelessness in that, because industrial time was regimented. You got up, you know, the factory bell rang, you went to work, you came home, you know, trains ran on time, etc. And now it's kind of like people work freelance around the clock, Uber drivers, you know, since it turns out they make $3.37 an hour, drive 60, 70-hour weeks. Tech people were boastful about working 90 hours a week and so forth. And time has become this kind of amorphous thing of which, you know, it's kind of shapeless and unstructured. There isn't a schedule anymore. And the schedule seemed like tyranny. There's a wonderful line about the mission bells as the California Indians were forced into the missions, kind of regimenting their lives. And now that seems kind of like when I think about it as a self-employed person who hasn't had a job since 1988, I think like, when I look at my friends with jobs, it's like, oh, you come home from work? Wow, what's that like?
Right.
You know, so like now time has become this kind of soupy amorphous thing where you can get on into your preferred social media toxin of choice and Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and it's going continuously and you can jump in at any point and jump out. And you know, there was something about the 72,000 years of porn on Pornhub. And like, you know, it would take all the lifetimes of everyone in this room and dozens more to watch everything on Pornhub, for example. So we live in this kind of like expanding and shrinking time. But I think that there was a sense where we went from organic form of the celestial calendar to the industrial form of the railroad schedule, the factory schedule, the productivity, the Model T Fords rolling off the assembly line every 10 minutes and the workers performing their Chaplin-esque mechanical gestures, to a kind of chaotic amorphousness that it's easy to feel lost and overwhelmed and consumed by. You know, it's liberating in some ways. You can get online and find somebody to talk to about being a gay teen in a homophobic town in the Midwest at 3 a.m., but you can't leave work because your boss, like, what's his name of Tesla? Elon Musk fired someone for going to attend the birth of his child instead of a meeting.
Wow.
And because you must always be available. And you can be available. You know, like, people used to go to conferences and it was kind of like wild and sexy. You were off the hook. Nobody knew what you were doing. It was, you know, and now it's like you can log in on your laptop and keep working on the report. Right. You know, you can get texted at any moment with what are you doing. So it's like, we've kind of, there's a kind of on and off, here and there kind of analog world that disappeared into that amorphousness, I would say.
Yeah, I'm going to actually take the other side of it, the place part of it, maybe. So I think you spoke really eloquently about that situation. I think there's something about how that kind of time has really shifted our idea of place, and something about you know, growing up in the city, and you were talking about the 70s and 80s. There was a kind of when you were like on the subway, you looked at other people. And that's like what you did. You either had a book that you were reading, or more likely you looked at people. You read the ads. And some of that was like people watching, and some of that was cruising. But there was something when you left your home, when you left your house, that space between there and wherever you were going was also kind of public time and social time. And hence like the whole cruising as being a really big part of that, and just also observing people and noticing people. I've started to notice that people's body language has really shifted. like in the subway or something, because it used to be, there were these little unconscious gestures of like, you'd see someone like, to let them pass. Like that inch doesn't really help them, but it's a kind of gesture of like, I see you're trying to pass me. There was a certain kind of language of how you moved in a tightly knit urban world where it was crowded, and now the street is not a social place. Everyone's trying to maintain the bubble of being in touch with their selected thread of people and their selected thread of news. So it's a very singular time. You're being in touch. It's amazing. It's awesome. Oh my God, you can be talking to a person that you love while you're like sitting on the boring subway. But also you're not on the subway, really. So again, I don't want to be a kind of Luddite and argue for like, it was better before, because that's retrograde, doesn't really get you anywhere. But it's a really consequential shift, I think, in terms of how people understand social space, hence how people understand activism, hence how people understand what politics means, what relationships mean, what sociality means, what a party means. Like all of these small shifts really change who we are sort of in a very animal way, like what it means to be in a room with people, what it means to be live. So these feel very, I don't want to judge them, but they feel very, very significant to me. And a place where like the space and the time, I don't know, does that answer your question?
I want to just add something quickly. Somebody made a comment to me that part of the power of Occupy Wall Street was that younger people who had done so much digitally, the kind of not really being present, found that just being physically present and physically coexisting with people they didn't necessarily choose, and like elite university students and homeless people and older people and stuff, like that sudden coming together in physical space, which happened first in Lower Manhattan and then all over the world, including Occupy Auckland and Occupy Kyoto and et cetera, was this kind of return to the power of coexistence with strangers, that finding of affinity, which has been kind of the foundational force of
Absolutely.
this revolution since at least the French, many peasant uprisings before the French Revolution, but kind of urban revolution.
And it's the body, right? Like the body has
is a bodily experience.
Yeah.
And whether it's the Women's March or next Saturday's march in D.C. and around the
democracy
country.
is a bodily experience.
Yes.
Is that what you just said? That's a keeper. Jot that down. Like that's a keeper. It is, because it really is the body, right? It's the okay. She's written it down.
It's in Wanderlust. It's in Wanderlust. I can send you the paragraph.
But it's a really good. I love
but
that
no,
sentence.
it is, because there is really the sense, and there was, and we're getting. I come from a beautiful city that has been swallowed alive by Silicon Valley. And so I have a front row on the fact that we're losing the kind of utopian illusions of marketing of Silicon Valley, and we're coming out the other side. But there was this idea like we would have virtual marches and virtual demonstrations and virtual this and virtual that. And it turns out that there is no substitute for coexisting bodily with each other. That matters, and it matters in a deep way. And I see the desire for people coming to talks and to these different kinds of conversations and encounters, that people are hungry for it. There isn't room for it in the same way. And that we don't always have the language to describe what it is and why it matters. But things happen when people coexist, and it's uncomfortable. And I see part of the buffering with technology is that it's difficult. Like, I can just sort of like stop texting you if you say something I disagree with. And, there's funny stuff, but about people like breaking up.
Rebecca?
Yeah, people breaking up by text, and kind of the easy out of like, but I don't really have to face people with the difficulty of being in a body and having a heart and having emotions and not being identical to each other. And that kind of unbufferedness, but it's where things happen.
It also is related to what you were talking about time being this endlessly elastic thing. And the body is both a place, that sharing of space, but also bodies have very real time. Like the body needs to sleep, the body needs to eat. It's a very different kind of clock that's not endlessly elastic. And I think sometimes the the enormous stress that we feel of trying to occupy this endlessly elastic space of 24-hour time, our body brings us back to like, actually, you need to eat, you need to sleep, you need to walk, you need to, be physically close to the people that you love. It's the body is a different kind of clock.
It is, but
It's
people
not all
often
just
think
relative
that triumph is
endlessly.
overriding it. But speaking of clocks, I see Megan looking at us.
People are hungry, right?
Yes.
People need to eat.
Okay, thank you for coexisting bodily
Thank
with
you.
us. Thank you, Zoe.
That
That was wonderful. To be continued.
And we have books for sale outside. Books for sale.